Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second talk organized by the Center of Voice Studies of 2026. And as we can see, we have Ida Marie Thomsen Krarup, who's going to tell us about developing methods to study audio-vibrotactile integration in speech perception. And Ida is based at the Department of English at Aarhus University, where she's finishing her MA. And if I'm not mistaken, this theme is actually part of your MA project as well.
Yes, yes.
And Ida managed to get the almost impossible to get funding to do a PhD with us as well. So I'm quite excited because it's always nice to get a lot of feedback when projects are beginning as well.
Mm.
So now I'll shut up. And Ida, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Misha, and thank you for inviting me to have the talk. I'm going to be talking about how we can study audio-vibrotactile integration in speech perception. And first, I'll just introduce you guys to what multisensory speech perception is, because I'm assuming not everyone is familiar with that already. And then I'm going to talk about what I mean when I say multisensory integration. And then I'm going to look at some methods for studying audio-vibrotactile integrations, both the ones that already exist and the ones that I'm kind of Frankensteining together from the existing literature. Um, so first, to talk about what speech perception is, I've brought the speech chain, which I think is a very illustrative example of a certain idea of speech perception that exists, namely that speech perception is primarily auditory or exclusively auditory, which we see here illustrated by the fact that speech is illustrated as sound waves that's transmitted through air that the listener and the speaker themselves have access to. And oral languages certainly are auditory, but auditory stimuli isn't the only thing that affects speech perception of oral languages. And there's plenty of evidence to support this. For example, we have a lot of evidence supporting the visual or the impact of visual stimuli on speech perception. The most famous one is the McGurk effect, which some of you might be familiar with. For those who aren't, it's an audiovisual illusion where participants are exposed to a sound clip of a speaker saying one syllable, for example, ga, and the audio or the visual, a video clip of the person saying, for example, um, ba, and then they report hearing da, something in between. Um, and so, and this experiment arguably shows that visual stimuli has an effect on how we perceive speech sounds. Um, there have also been audiovisual training studies that show that if you train participants with audiovisual stimuli, they get better at comprehending degraded speech or speech and background noise. And audiovisual training has also been shown to be effective for the acquisition of non-native speech sounds that are visually contrastive. So there's plenty of evidence to support a visual influence on speech perception. Additionally, there's also the influence of tactile stimuli. That is to say, the stimuli that we can feel um, that can also influence speech perception. Most notably, there's the Tadoma method, which is a speech perception method that is used primarily by deaf and blind perceivers of oral languages. And it's basically a method where you put your hand on the speaker's face so that you can feel their lips and their chin and their throat. So you have access to their articulatory movements, the airflow from their mouth and nose, so you can feel aspiration, for example. And then also importantly, or what I think is the most interesting, you also have access to the vibrations from the vocal tract, which has significance for the voicing of sounds, which is quite cool. Um, so that's a method that's used by deaf and blind perceivers. Um, it hasn't been investigated so much in perceivers who also have access to uh, normal auditory and visual stimuli, but the specifically aerotactile input has been investigated actually for aspiration contrasts. Gig and Derek did this for native English speakers with the English p and b contrast, which is an aspiration contrast. And they found that um, when the audio of the unaspirated sound b was played, if it was played congruently with a puff of air administered to the hand or the neck, the perceivers were more likely to perceive it as an aspirated sound, indicating that this can also be stimuli that affects the perception for normal hearing. Speakers, and Saito et al. Did this with native French speakers as well, where they replicated the findings for non-native speakers as well. So there is also a basis to say that tactile stimuli can affect speech perception. And on the basis of their study, Gig, Wilson, and Derek then revised the speech chain that we saw earlier, so it's a bit more complicated. So now we not only have the sound waves, but also the facial movements and the airflow and the haptic feedback that you get yourself when you're producing the movements. Yeah, so just to say that the speech perception is a bit more complicated than just the auditory dimension of things that we're very used to thinking of as phoneticians. And before I move on to talk more about integration, even though I'm not a neuroscientist, I'd like to talk a bit about the neurological basis of why we might be seeing this. And it's been shown by Pulvermüller et al. That the neurological circuits that are active during production, they are also active during the perception of the same speech sounds. During perception, specific motor circuits are activated in the prefrontal cortex, and these are the same circuits that are also used when you make the articulatory movements of those sounds that you're perceiving. And so this might mean, or my question as someone who's not a neuroscientist, but still interested in this, is whether this means that the information from these production processes are also available to us during perception. For example, might this explain why we saw the results we saw with the aerotactile input and the perception of aspiration contrasts? And might this also mean that vibrations that mimic vocal fold vibrations might affect how we perceive sounds as voiced or unvoiced because of the link here between production and perception. And that's what I'd like to look at. And to look at that, we have to see if there's audio-vibrotactile integration. And so it might be a good time for me to define what I actually mean by integration. A very basic definition of integration or multisensory integration could be the presence of a statistically significant change in the response to a cross-modal stimulus complex compared to unimodal stimuli, so that participants respond significantly differently to multisensory input as opposed to just, for example, auditory input. Yes, and so most of the studies I've mentioned so far are actually examples of multisensory integration. I just didn't call them that at that time. And one thing that's important for multisensory integration to occur is what's usually called the assumption of unity, which is just the assumption that the stimuli is coming from the same source. Perceivers have to perceive them as having one point of origin. And something that's usually important to the assumption of unity is that they are somewhat spatially and temporally coincident, that they're occurring from around the same space and at around the same time. But it's important to note that they actually don't have to be perceived as synchronous in order for integration to occur, which might seem a little bit counterintuitive. Yadbak et al. Found that they did a study with the McGurk effect, but where they specifically used asynchronous stimuli, and they asked the participants for each trial whether it was synchronous or asynchronous and what they heard. And they found that sometimes integration occurred even if they said that the stimuli was asynchronous. So perceivers don't have to, somewhat counterintuitively, don't have to think that it's synchronous in order to actually have this integration occur. So there's something called the temporal window of integration, which is then the window that the stimuli can be separated with, where integration can still occur. And then the temporal window of synchrony is then different, though there's often a large overlap between the two, but they don't have to be synchronous in order for integration to occur. And then the last term I want to introduce in connection with integration is the principle of inverse effectiveness, which is basically the idea that with greater perceptual difficulty, you rely more on multisensory stimulus. For example, if you're in a noisy setting where you're having a hard time perceiving what someone is saying, you might find yourself looking more at someone's lips when they're talking in order to gain that extra information to comprehend better what they're saying. So that's basically the principle of inverse effectiveness. And so if we want to look at audio-vibrotactile integration, what does it occur? How can we study it? There are already a few ways that it has been looked at that I've kind of put into two categories here, and I'll explain what I mean by them in a bit. The first is using tactile aids with somewhat arbitrary haptic codes, and then the other one is looking at connected speech in background noise. So the first one is using these tactile aids. I've brought here photos on the right from Breed et al., who made a sleeve with a bunch of vibration motors inside that you then wrap around the participant's arm. And then depending on what speech sound was played, these vibration motors would vibrate at different locations at a different frequency. And then through training, the participants were taught to associate certain frequencies in certain locations with a certain sound. And that's what I mean by somewhat arbitrary. The participants are trained to associate these things that are chosen at somewhat random. And they did find that this was effective. After, I think it was 1 to 4 hours of training, they had a mean accuracy of 86% from their participants. So you can train this kind of association for these tactile aids. And Rissa et al. Did something similar with a dynamic braille stimulator, which is the one you see on the left. It has these vibrating pins that you can place your thumb on, and then they can vibrate in different patterns, moving in different directions. And they also chose to associate certain sounds like da and ba with certain directions, like going up and going down. And they did not, while they also trained their participants, they didn't find evidence of audio-vibrotactile integration in their study. So this is also the area that has, in my opinion, the weakest evidence supporting the existence of audio-vibrotactile integration. And then there's another way it has been looked at, which is speech and background noise. Both of these studies looked at connected speech. I think one was in French and one was in German, where they then converted the frequencies from the speech into frequency range that was better fit for being conveyed through a vibrotactile signal. Schultz et al. Has a really thorough walkthrough of how they did this. And then they asked participants to repeat the sounds or the speech that they heard afterwards. And then they evaluated, okay, how close was what they said to the actual speech that was said. And in both studies, they found that they were significantly more accurate in reporting back what was said when they had audio-vibrotactile stimuli compared to the audio-only stimuli. So they found an effect of audio-vibrotactile integration here. And the vibrotactile signal was just mostly just following the amplitude of the speech signal, if that makes sense. It's a bit more complicated than that, but that's the basic idea. But what both of these methods don't help us answer, and what I would like to maybe look at with my studies for my MA and for my PhD, is whether vibrations that mimic vocal fold vibration can affect the perception of speech sounds, specifically of whether sounds are perceived as voiced or unvoiced, and whether they can aid the acquisition of non-native speech sounds, especially for voicing contrasts. So how do we go about doing this? Well, first we could look at just the perception of voicing contrasts and whether vibrations might play a role in, or could play a role in perceiving a sound as voiced or unvoiced. And here we know that, or Chen Wu and Murray found that modal phonation can span a range of frequencies from 100 to 350 hertz in their study, where they asked participants of different genders to produce both loud, low, high, and normal modal phonation, and this was the range of frequencies that they reported. If you're looking at something like falsetto, you might vocal fold vibrations might occur at a higher frequency, but this is the frequency range that they found, and the skin is sensitive to vibrations at below 700 hertz. So that's the frequencies that vocal fold vibrations occur at. Can also be conveyed through vibrations that the skin is sensitive to. And one voicing contrast that you could look at in this connection is English, or the English alveolar fricative voicing contrast, English s and z, which I probably didn't pronounce very super clearly because it's very difficult for native Danish speakers to both perceive and to produce. Yes, and so one way I would propose looking at this is that you can borrow a lot from the experimental paradigm that Gig and Derrick used in 2009. They were the ones who did the puff of air and aspiration contrast experiment. So you could have 3 conditions. They had 2, but I would propose 3, where you have one where the participants only hear audio to hear how they perceive the contrast when there's only audio, then one where you have vibration concurrent with the audio, and then also a control condition where you have both, where you have a tap administered to the hand simultaneously with the audio. I would propose this control condition because, as we saw from some of the earlier studies, associations between stimuli can be taught, and it might be that if there is an effect of this vibration, it might be that it's not unique to the vibration, and that it might occur with any other tactile stimuli. So we'd have to have a controlled tactile stimuli in order to test that, and in order to be sure whether, if any effect is found, is it because the vibrations mimic vocal fold vibration, or is it just a general response to tactile stimulus? And then Gig and Derrick used categorical stimuli for their experiment, and I'm going to use continuous stimuli. I'm going to use an 11-step spectrum just because it gives it allows for a more detailed look at it to see whether it pushes the category boundary further to one side or another in any of the conditions. Yeah, and just to get a little bit more specific about how you can do it, I've listed here the the devices that I'm using for it. I'm using a audio exciter for the vibrations. That means you can send an audio signal to the vibration, like a vibration motor, like a sine wave, and then it will play that as a vibration. So you can control what frequency it will be vibrating at. And then I'm using a solenoid for the control stimuli. It's just a little metal device that shoots a pin out of it that with a flat surface that then goes against the skin. Very gently, but you can feel it. So that's what I'll use for control stimuli. And then there's not so much information on the temporal window of integration for audio-vibrotactile input. I found a study claiming that it's 451 milliseconds if the tactile stimuli comes first, if it's perceived as synchronous. But as I mentioned earlier, the temporal window of synchrony and the temporal window of integration isn't necessarily the same. So I actually don't know what the temporal window of integration is. It could be interesting to look at. That means I will try to get them as synchronous as possible with as little delay as possible, because I don't know what is the window of time for integration in this case. And lastly, I want to talk about how can we look at how whether these vibrations might help people acquire difficult non-native speech sounds that differ on terms of voicing, specifically because the principle of inverse effectiveness suggests that with greater perceptual difficulty, we have greater reliance on multisensory stimulus. So if you have a difficult speech sound contrast, will the multisensory input then be of more use there if it's just if it's the additional modality distinguishes between the two stimuli if they're different in that additional modality. So I would suggest looking at this with a multisensory training paradigm. You could do this with English, this English and z, which is notoriously difficult for Danish, native Danish speakers. And you could take a very basic pre-test, training phase, and post-test paradigm here, where you compare the pre-test and the post-test performance for different groups that receive different treatment in the training phase. So the pre-test and the post-test would both have an audio-only condition and an audio-tactile condition in order to compare the response from cross-modal stimuli to unimodal stimuli. And then in the training phase, you'd have 3 different groups, one that receives audio-only training, and one that receives audio-tactile training, to see whether these 2 training modalities might have different effects, might be differently effective for the participants. And then also a control group with no training, just to see if just the fact of them coming to a post-test and a pre-test in itself and becoming more aware of this contrast might cause a difference in performance that has nothing to do with training, but just with the fact that we're studying them. Yeah. And so just to sum up, I suggested 2 new methods of how we might study audio-vibrotactile integration that can add to the research that already exists in this area and on multisensory speech perception in general. Yeah. And that was it for my talk. Thank you so much for listening.